The cabin my grandfather saved for me. At 57, I learned something I wish I had learned sooner. Being erased from a company hurts, but it does not hurt nearly as much as the moment you realize you have nowhere left in the world to drive to. The cardboard box was still in the passenger seat when I turned onto a logging road I hadn't seen in 26 years. The snow was falling so thick the wipers couldn't keep up. My hands were raw from gripping the steering wheel, and when I rounded the last bend through the pines, what I saw made me slam the brakes so hard the truck slid sideways in the snow. The cabin door was already open. Smoke was rising from a chimney that should have been cold for 14 years. And what I would eventually find hidden behind the cast-iron stove inside that cabin would not just save my life. It would force me to question everything I thought I knew about the man who raised me. My name is Marin Whitfield. Before I tell you what waited for me in those mountains, I have to tell you how I got there. Because the cabin didn't save me. Not really. I had to walk through the door first, and to walk through that door, I had to lose almost everything else. It started on a Tuesday in November. The Tuesday it ended. I wore the navy blazer my grandfather Silas had bought me the day I got the job at Halverson and Hale Insurance. I didn't do it on purpose. I just grabbed it off the hook, the way I had 1,000 other mornings for 30 years. By 11:14 that morning, I was sitting across from a man named Mr. Lindgren, 32 years old. He couldn't quite look at me. He used the word restructuring in 4 different ways. By 11:32, I was carrying a cardboard box across the lobby of the Portland corporate building I had walked into as a 27-year-old. Past co-workers who suddenly found their phones very interesting. The blazer still smelled faintly of my grandfather's pipe smoke. Cherry vanilla. 30 years. That was the detail my mind kept returning to as I walked across that lobby. The smell of a man who had been dead for 14 years. I almost made it to the parking lot without crying. I almost did. I would have if I hadn't passed Verna Cole standing by the elevators with her own cardboard box. Verna was 60 years old. She had been a claims manager at Halverson and Hale for 26 years. She had been let go 6 weeks before me. She had come back that morning to clean out the rest of her cubicle. She saw my box. She saw my face. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she set her own box down on the marble floor. She walked across the lobby, and she put one hand on my elbow. "Marin," she said, "it's a club nobody asks to join. But you're not alone in it. Call me when you're ready." She slipped a small, folded square of paper into the pocket of my blazer. I didn't look at it for 3 weeks. When I finally did, it was her phone number, written in pencil. Underneath, in the same careful handwriting, were 4 words. "I'm still here." V. I didn't call her. Not for months. But I kept the paper. I didn't cry in the parking lot. I didn't cry when I got home and set the box on the kitchen counter next to a stack of unopened bills. I didn't cry that night, or the next, or the one after that. I just sat at my small dining table watching the numbers in my checking account drop. The way leaves fall in October. Slowly at first. Then all at once. The severance ate my health insurance. My father's final hospice bills had already eaten the savings. The lawyer's fees from my divorce from Garrett Marsh 4 years earlier had eaten everything in between. And then, 3 weeks after I lost my job, I got a letter from the bank. In the polite cold language banks use when they take things from you, the letter explained that my 401k retirement account had been frozen for 18 months. There was a clause in my employment contract I had never read carefully. The money I had counted on, the money I had worked 30 years to build, was sitting behind glass I could not break. Every job application I submitted came back the same way. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Other candidates. I knew what that meant when you were 57. They had seen the year I graduated from college and decided I belonged in a museum. My son Lyndon lived in Austin, Texas, 31 years old, married a year and a half, working in software. I had texted him the day of the layoff. "Hey, honey, got laid off today. Would love to hear your voice." He responded 4 days later, a thumbs-up emoji, a single sentence. "Sorry to hear, Mom. Crazy week here." That was the last I had heard from him, and I didn't blame him. Not really. I had been so consumed caring for my father Donovan in his final 2 years. The falls, the dementia, the long night drives to the emergency room. I had let my son drift into a quiet stranger. Garrett had warned me about it during the divorce. You give every piece of yourself to people who are leaving, Maren. There won't be anything left for the people who want to stay. I had hated him for saying it. I hated him more now that I suspected he might have been right. By March, the eviction notice was taped to my apartment door. By the second week of April, the truck was packed. What little was left of my life crammed into the bed of a 2009 Ford Ranger I had inherited from my father. The only thing the lawyers and the hospice and the bank had not been able to take. I sold the wedding ring. I sold the engagement ring my grandmother Ingrid had passed down to me when I turned 20. I sold my mother's silver. I had $516 in my account, a quarter tank of gas, and an iron key on a leather cord that had been hanging from my rearview mirror for 48 years. Before I tell you what that key opened, I want to ask you something. Where in the country are you watching from tonight? Drop your state in the comments below. And if you have ever held on to something small, a key, a letter, a promise from someone you loved, just to remember they once believed in you, type the words "I remember" in the comments. I'll read every single one. I want to know you are out there with me tonight. Now, the key. The summer I was 9 years old, in 1978, my parents nearly divorced for the first time. My mother sent me to spend 2 months with my grandfather Silas at his hunting cabin in the Cabinet Mountains of northwestern Montana. My grandfather was a quiet man, a face like weathered cedar, hands that could split a piece of firewood with one stroke, and then, 10 minutes later, carve a wooden owl so delicate you could see the feathers. He had been a Marine in the Korean War. He had come home from a place called Incheon in 1952, and he had never spoken about it. Not to my grandmother, not to my father, not to me, except for one night that summer. We were sitting on the front porch of the cabin. He was carving a small wooden owl for me. The crickets were so loud you almost had to shout to be heard. But he wasn't shouting. He was speaking the way men of his generation spoke when they were saying something important, quiet, slow, like he was placing each word down carefully on a table he didn't want to scratch. He told me there had been a boy in his unit named Calvin. He had pulled Calvin out of a paddy field outside Incheon when both of them were 18 years old. But Calvin's leg had been broken so badly, the medics had loaded him onto a transport ship the next morning. Silas had never known whether he survived the crossing. He told me he had carried that not knowing for 26 years. Then he set down the carving. He reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out an iron key on a leather cord. He took my small hand in his enormous, calloused one. He pressed the key into my palm, and he closed my fingers around it. "Marin," he said, "this cabin is yours. I'm putting you on the deed when you're old enough. But this key, you keep this with you. And when the world finally takes everything from you, and it will, kiddo, the world is like that. You drive to this cabin. Don't tell anyone you're coming. Don't ask for permission. Just drive. And when you get here, don't open what's behind the stove until you've got nothing left to lose." I laughed. The way 9-year-olds laugh at promises adults make. I wasn't laughing on the morning of April 15th, 2026. When I climbed into the Ford Ranger with that same key on its same leather cord and turned east toward the mountains. The drive from Portland to the Cabinet Mountains takes about 11 hours, if the weather holds. The weather did not hold. By the time I crossed into Idaho, the rain had turned to snow. By the time I reached Missoula, the storm was thick enough that I had to pull off the highway. I found a small diner on the corner of Higgins Avenue, a flickering neon sign that read Maple Leaf Diner. A pickup truck out front, so old, it looked like it had been parked there since the Eisenhower administration. The woman behind the counter was somewhere in her mid-60s, silver hair pulled back in a low knot. The kind of laugh lines that come from a life spent being kind to strangers. She poured me coffee without asking. She slid a menu across the chipped formica. "Honey," she said, "you look like you've been driving since the Truman administration. Eat something." I ordered the eggs. I didn't have the energy to choose anything more complicated. While I waited, my hand drifted up to the iron key around my neck. The way you touch a wound, you have stopped noticing. The woman behind the counter saw it. Her hand stopped pouring mid-pour. "Where did you get that key, sweetheart?" I told her my grandfather gave it to me. "And what was your grandfather's name?" "Silas Whitfield." She set the coffee pot down very slowly. The way you set down a glass when you don't want it to break. She wiped her hands on her apron, though they weren't wet. And then she came around the counter and sat down across from me in the booth. "My name is Odessa Halloran," she said. "I knew your grandfather. My husband Wendell, God rest him, he learned woodworking from Silas back in '85. Spent every Saturday up at that cabin for 9 years. Silas talked about you all the time, Marin. He always said his granddaughter would come up that road one day. He said, when she did, the rest of us were supposed to take care of her." I sat there in that diner booth, eggs going cold in front of me. A stranger across from me who had been waiting for me, in some quiet way, for almost 40 years. And I started to cry, not loud. Just the kind of crying you do when something inside you that has been holding on for too long finally lets go. Odessa put her hand over mine. "You drive safe up there, honey," she said. "Storm's getting worse. And listen to me. Whoever is at that cabin when you get there, you are not in any danger. Do you understand me? Whoever is there has been waiting for you." I want to pause for just a moment. If you have ever had a stranger see you on the worst day of your life and treat you like you mattered, would you tell me about her tonight? Just her first name. just one sentence. I want to know how many of you have been seen by women you'll never see again. Because I think it happens more often than we admit. And I think those women deserve to be remembered out loud. I drove the last 4 hours from Missoula into the Cabinets through a storm that turned the highway into a tunnel of white. The logging road that led to my grandfather's cabin was unmarked, but I found it the way you find an old prayer, by feel, not by sight. The truck climbed for 40 minutes through pines so heavy with snow they looked like they were kneeling. And then, at the last bend, through a curtain of falling white, I saw it. The cabin. And the door was already open. And there was another truck parked beside it. A pickup. Not the Chevy, I would later learn, belonged to Hollis Garrett. A different truck, with Colorado plates. My sister Camille lived in Denver. I sat in the truck with my foot still pressed hard on the brake, the engine idling, snow ticking against the windshield in slow, deliberate taps. The cabin sat 50 yards ahead through the trees, exactly where I remembered it. The steep, pitched roof. The river stone chimney my grandfather had laid by hand the summer I turned 7. The door, the heavy oak door with the iron hinges Silas had forged himself, was cracked open about a foot. The chimney that had no business breathing was exhaling a thin gray column of wood smoke into the falling snow. And 50 feet from the porch sat a black Ford F250 with Colorado plates, a dent on the rear bumper. I would have recognized that dent anywhere. Camille had put it there backing into a stone planter at our father's funeral. My sister had gotten here first. I almost turned around. I want you to understand that. I almost put the truck in reverse and drove back down that mountain through the storm. And I do not know what I would have done after that. But before my hand could move to the gear shift, the cabin door opened the rest of the way, and the man who stepped onto the porch was not Camille, and he was not her husband Brennan either. He was a tall man, somewhere in his early 70s, a thick gray beard, the kind of careful, unhurried movements that come from a body that has been broken and rebuilt more than once. He wore a faded green flannel shirt and suspenders. He raised one hand in a slow, open palm. The other hand stayed visible at his side, a man who had thought about how to look unthreatening to someone who would arrive scared. He did not call out. He just stood there on the porch in the snow and waited for me to decide. I turned off the engine. The silence after the engine died was so complete. I could hear the snow landing on the hood. I opened the door. I stepped out into a cold that climbed into the seams of my jacket and announced itself in my lungs. And I walked toward the porch with the iron key gripped in my fist like the handle of a knife. "My name is Hollis Garrett," he said, when I got within speaking distance. "Your grandfather and I worked the Yak River fire together in 1982. He pulled me out of a blow-up that killed 4 other men on my crew. I have owed him since. He told me you would come one day. He didn't say when. He just said I would know." "And the truck," I said. My voice was barely a voice. "The Colorado plates. That isn't your sister, Miss Whitfield." He had said my name without me giving it to him. "That is a man named Whitman Tate. He drives up here every spring to pick up something your grandfather built him. Today is the day. He's inside warming up. He didn't know you were coming. Neither did I exactly. But the bank sent the trustee a flag 2 weeks ago. Address change on your driver's license. Portland to a forwarding box. That meant you were running. So I lit the stove. I stood there in the snow with the key in my fist, trying to make my mind work, trying to understand that this stranger had lit a fire inside my dead grandfather's cabin 2 weeks ago because a piece of paper at a bank in Helena had told him a woman he had never met was finally on her way. "Come inside, Miss Whitfield," Hollis said gently. "You are about to fall down." This is a good place to pause, because what I'm about to tell you next is the part of the story that broke something open in me that I had not even known was sealed shut. And I want you to be ready. If this story is reaching you tonight, if any of it feels familiar, I'd be grateful if you took a second to subscribe to this channel. These stories take weeks to put together. The only thing that keeps them coming is you, sitting wherever you are sitting tonight, deciding to stay. Now, let me show you what was inside my grandfather's cabin. The cabin was warm. That was the first thing that hit me. A deep wood fire warmth that climbed into my bones and made me realize how cold I actually was. The second thing was the smell: cedar, gun oil, coffee, and underneath all of it, faint and impossible, pipe smoke. Cherry vanilla pipe smoke, the exact blend my grandfather had smoked his entire life. A second man sat at the long pine dining table at the far end of the room. He was somewhere in his late 30s, clean-shaven, wearing a wool sweater the color of moss. He stood up when I came in. There was something about the way he stood, careful and a little embarrassed, that told me he had heard the conversation on the porch and understood he was an intruder in a moment that did not belong to him. "Ma'am," he said, "I am so sorry to be here. My name is Whitman Tate. I drove up from Denver. Mr. Garrett told me your grandfather's clock would be ready today. I had no idea you were coming. I can leave right now. Please tell me what you'd like me to do." He gestured at the floor beside the table. There was a wooden crate there, padded with quilts, and rising out of it like something dragged up from another century was a tall walnut grandfather clock. The case carved with mountain laurel and pine cones, the brass pendulum motionless behind a glass door, the face hand-painted with a Montana valley at sunrise. I walked over to it without saying a word. I knelt down beside the crate. I touched the carved laurel with one fingertip, and on the bottom of the clock case, in my grandfather's small, careful handwriting, burned into the wood with a pyrography iron, were the words, "For Calvin. Made by S. Whitfield. 2009. Calvin, the boy from Incheon, the boy he had lost on a transport ship in 1952. My grandfather had built a clock for him 57 years later, and someone, somehow, was here to take it home." Whitman cleared his throat. "My father's name is Calvin Tate. He served with your grandfather in the Marine Corps. They were 18 years old together. My dad survived because Silas pulled him out of a paddy field outside Incheon when his leg was shattered. He came home, got married, had me. He died last summer at 92. He had ordered this clock from your grandfather in 2007. But he told Silas to take his time, because he wanted to give it to my son for his 18th birthday. My son turns 18 next month. I'm here to bring his great-grandfather's clock home. I want you to understand something. I had spent 48 years thinking the boy from Incheon, the boy named Calvin, had probably died on that ship. My grandfather had never said it out loud, but I had assumed I had carried the assumption for almost 5 decades, and now I was kneeling on the floor of a cabin in the Cabinet Mountains of Montana, beside a hand-built grandfather clock, learning that Calvin Tate had lived a long, full life, had married, had a son, had a grandson, and my grandfather had spent the last 2 years of his own life building a clock to send across 2 generations, just so the boy he saved would have something beautiful to leave behind. I sat down on the floor of the cabin with my back against the leg of the dining table, and I cried. Not quietly this time. The kind of crying that comes up from somewhere underneath you. Whitman Tate did the kindest thing a stranger has ever done in my presence. He sat down on the floor beside me, not touching me, not speaking. He just kept me company until I was finished. Hollis poured 3 mugs of coffee from a blue enamel pot on the cast-iron stove. He set them on the table without saying a word. He had clearly done this before. Not this exact moment, but this kind of moment. The kind where someone arrives at this cabin and the past arrives with them. When I could finally speak again, I asked Whitman if he would stay the night, because the storm had gotten worse, and because I did not want him to drive that clock back down the mountain in the dark. He thanked me. He said he would sleep in the loft room. He thanked me 3 more times before he made it up the stairs. The kindest people are always the ones most worried about being a burden. I sat at the dining table with Hollis Garrett, and I let him tell me the rest. My grandfather had gotten sick in the spring of 2010. A cardiologist in Hamilton had told him his heart was giving out. He had maybe a year. Silas had not told my father. He had not told my aunt. He had not told my Uncle Roy. He had driven out to Hollis Garrett's place one Sunday evening with a bottle of bourbon and a manila folder. He had sat at Hollis's kitchen table. "Hollis," he had said, "I'm calling in everything I owe you. And I'm calling it in for one reason only." He had opened the folder. He had shown Hollis a photograph of me at 26, holding my newborn son Lyndon on the porch of this very cabin. "Hollis," my grandfather had said, "my Marin has the spine of every Whitfield who ever logged a mountain. But she is going to spend her whole damn life giving that spine to people who do not deserve it. And one day, there will be nothing left of her. And that is the day she will come up that road. I need you to keep this place alive until she does. I do not know when. I am setting up an account that will pay you $1 a year for 20 years to do it. Sign this contract. Do not tell anyone. Do not let my children sell it. Do not let the county tear it down. Just keep it ready." Hollis had signed. Silas had died 9 months later. Hollis had been coming up to the cabin 3 or 4 times a month for 14 years. He had reshingled the roof, replaced the porch boards, kept the well from freezing, kept the locks oiled. The county thought he was a caretaker hired by an estate. The estate thought he was a volunteer family friend. The truth was, my grandfather had paid him $1 a year out of an account at a small bank in Helena. On a contract Silas had drafted himself on a sheet of legal paper, and Hollis had cashed every one of those dollars. He pulled a small folded square of paper out of the breast pocket of his flannel shirt and slid it across the table. It was a photocopy of a check dated December of last year, made out to Hollis Garrett, in the amount of $1, signed in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting from beyond the grave. He set it up for 20 years, Hollis said. We are at year 14. I was beginning to wonder if you would come at all. I lifted my coffee. My hand shook so badly I had to set it back down. Why didn't anyone in the family know about this? Why did he hide it from his own children? Hollis looked at me for a long moment. He picked up his pipe, turned it in his fingers, set it down again without lighting it. Because your grandfather was an honest man, Miss Whitfield. And honest men tell honest truths. And his honest truth was that he did not trust his own children to protect what he loved most. He told me once. He said, "My son Donovan is a kind man with no backbone, and my son Roy is a fool with a checkbook, and my daughter Helene is a snob who married money. None of them are bad. None of them are good in the way Marin is good. So I am going to put it all in her name, and let her decide what to do with the rest of them." He paused. He looked at the cast-iron stove for a long second. Then he looked back at me. "Your sister Camille is going to come up this road within the next 2 weeks. He told me that too. He said she would smell the money before any of the others did. He said when she came, I was to make sure you had read what was behind the stove first. Because what is behind the stove is not just for your protection. It is your inheritance, and it is your weapon." I did not sleep that night. I climbed the narrow stairs to the small bedroom on the second floor with my boots still on. I fell face first onto a quilt that smelled of cedar and lavender. I lay there in the dark, listening to the wind move through the pines, and the soft, regular breathing of a stranger named Whitman Tate sleeping in the loft above me. The grandfather clock his father had ordered from my grandfather 17 years ago waiting downstairs on the cabin floor for its journey home. I lay there, and I thought about the word inheritance. I thought about the word weapon. I thought about my sister Camille, driving up a mountain somewhere in the dark with my brother-in-law Brennan in a black F-25. Oh, smelling money, the way our grandfather had said she would. And I thought about a sentence my grandfather had said to me when I was 9 years old, sitting on this same porch. "Don't open what's behind the stove until you've got nothing left to lose." I had nothing left to lose. I had known that since the cardboard box. I had known it since the eviction notice. I had known it since my son Lyndon's thumbs-up emoji. But I was too tired that night to open anything. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, I slept. I woke to the smell of bacon, and the sound of Hollis Garrett moving around the kitchen with the careful quietness of a man who has spent his life trying not to wake people. The storm had blown itself out overnight. The window beside the bed was full of pale yellow sun and a forest of snow-laden pines, so still and bright it looked like a postcard from a country I had never visited. A folded stack of clothing sat on the wooden chair beside the bed. Flannel shirts, thick wool socks, a knit cap. All of them clearly belonged to my grandmother Ingrid. With a note pinned to the top in handwriting I did not yet recognize. These were Ingrid's. He kept them in the cedar chest. "They will fit you. Coffee is downstairs. M.M., not Hollis." M. I would learn within the hour that M was Marlene Garrett, 68 years old, retired hospice nurse, Hollis's wife of 43 years. She had let herself in at 6 o'clock that morning with a basket of fresh bread and a jar of huckleberry jam she had canned herself the previous August. I came down the stairs in my socks, wearing one of my grandmother's flannel shirts over my own. The cabin in daylight was a different cabin entirely. The morning sun lit up details I had not been able to see in the storm. The hand-carved wooden owls on the mantel, the elk antlers above the door, the wall of black and white photographs near the staircase. Marlene was standing at the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand. She was a small, soft-bodied woman. Short, white hair. Eyes the color of the lake at the bottom of the property in summer. When she saw me, she set down the spoon. She walked across the cabin, and she put both of her arms around me without saying a word. She held on, and held on, and held on. The way women of a certain generation hold on when they understand that the woman they are holding has not been held by another woman in a very long time. When she finally let go, she put both of her hands on my face. She looked into me. "Your grandfather talked about you every single day, sweetheart." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. I was his nurse for the last 11 months of his life. Every morning when I came in, he would squeeze my hand, and he would tell me, "Maren is going to come up that road one day, Marlene, and you are going to be there to feed her." Whitman Tate left at 9 o'clock that morning. The grandfather clock secured in the bed of his truck under 3 quilts and a tarp. He hugged me on the porch before he left. He told me his son's name was Calvin, after his grandfather. He told me he would call me when the boy turned 18 and the clock was running in his bedroom for the first time. I told him I would answer. When his truck disappeared down the logging road, I stood alone on the porch for a long minute and looked at the cabin in the morning light. The porch was swept. The firewood was stacked under the eaves in tight, neat rows the way Silas had always stacked it. Bark side down, ends aligned. A small chopping block beside it with an axe sunk into the top. The window glass was clean. The boards I remembered being weathered to silver had been restained a deep walnut. Someone had been keeping this cabin alive for 14 years. I walked back inside. Marlene was at the wall of photographs. "He hung these the year before he died," she said. "He told me where each of them went. He made me promise that if anything in this cabin ever got moved or sold, the wall would stay. I have dusted it every 2 weeks for 14 years. I joined her. And what I saw on that wall broke me open in a way that the cardboard box never had. There were dozens of photographs, hung in a careful grid, framed in simple black wood. My grandmother as a young woman in a gingham dress leaning against a Studebaker. My father Donovan as a boy holding up a brook trout almost as long as his arm. My Uncle Roy at 12 looking already disappointed in something. And then, taking up the largest portion of the wall, me, Maren. A photograph of me at 6 on this very porch. Hair in pigtails. Missing 2 front teeth. A photograph of me at 9 in my grandfather's flannel jacket. The same jacket. The one I could almost feel against my skin even now. A photograph of me at 16. Sullen. Arms crossed. Refusing to smile for the camera the summer my parents had nearly divorced for the second time. A photograph of me at 26, holding a newborn Lyndon in this very cabin. Both of us swaddled in a wool blanket. I had forgotten I had ever brought Lyndon here. I had forgotten the entire visit. But there it was, hanging on a wall in the mountains of Montana. Evidence that I had once been a young mother with a baby and a future. There were no photographs of my brother. None of my sister Camille. None of my Uncle Roy past the age of 12. The wall was a wall about me. About Maren. as if my grandfather had been quietly building a shrine to one specific grandchild for 40 years, and had simply never told anyone he was doing it. If you have ever found out, after someone you loved was gone, that they had been carrying you in their heart in ways you never knew, would you tell me about them tonight? Just their first name. Just one sentence. Let's honor them together. There is something powerful that happens when women our age remember out loud the people who loved us in silence. Beside my grandfather's reading chair, on a small table beneath a kerosene lamp, sat a leather-bound journal. Plain. Worn. My grandfather's handwriting on the cover in faded ink. For Maren. When you're ready. I sat down in the chair. The leather sighed under me like an old friend recognizing my weight. I opened the journal slowly. The first page had a single line, written in the careful, deliberate hand I remembered from birthday cards. Maren, if you're reading this, I was right. I'm sorry I was right. I tried not to be. I read for 3 hours. The journal was not a diary. It was a record. My grandfather had been writing in it on and off for nearly 40 years, and almost every entry was about me. Notes from my childhood visits, things I had said at 6, at 9, at 14, observations he had made about my temperament, the day I had cried over a wounded sparrow at the creek, the day I had refused to let my cousin Roy Jr. shoot a doe because the doe had a fawn. The summer I was 17 and had told Silas I was thinking of becoming a social worker. And he had written underneath in his careful hand, "She's already a social worker. She's been one since she was 6. The world will mistake this for weakness. It is not weakness. It is the most dangerous kind of strength, because the people who have it almost always destroy themselves protecting people who don't deserve them." I read that line 4 times. There were entries about my marriage to Garrett. Silas had only met him twice, but he had written after the second meeting, "He's not a bad man. He's a small one. She'll outgrow him in 15 years, and he'll never forgive her for it." My grandfather had died before the divorce. He had also been right by 12 months. There were entries about my father Donovan, written in a tone I had never heard my grandfather use aloud. Disappointed, weary, almost mournful. "My son is a kind man with no backbone. When I am gone, he will not protect her. He will lean on her. The whole family will lean on her. They will lean and lean until she falls, because that is what families do to the one strong person inside them. They use her up and call it love." And then, near the back of the journal, 2 pages I read 3 times because I could not believe the first reading. "Camille will come hungry. She always has been. The first time I saw it was the Christmas she was 6, and she took her cousin's dollhouse home in her suitcase, and her mother defended her. There is a sickness in her that her mother could not see, and her father refused to. Maren will have to be ready. When the time comes, the proof is in the second envelope behind the stove. I have been keeping it for 28 years. I never wanted to use it. I never wanted Maren to need it. But I have learned in this long life that sometimes the only way to protect the ones you love is to be willing to be the one holding the harder truth. I closed the journal. I set it on my knees. I looked at the cast iron stove on the far wall. It was massive, black. Sitting on a slab of fieldstone my grandfather had laid himself when he was a young man. It had been heating this cabin for 63 winters. I had assumed when I read the letter in the truck, that behind the stove was a metaphor, that I would find a hidden compartment in the wall behind it. But Silas had never been a metaphorical man. I stood up. I walked across the room. I knelt beside the stove. I ran my fingers along the fieldstone slab beneath it, and the slab moved. Not all of it, just the front portion. Where my fingers found a deliberate seam I would never have noticed if I had not been looking. I pried it up with both hands. It was hinged. It was a small trap door disguised as a hearthstone, and beneath it, set into the floor like a safe, was a steel box. And before I could lift the lid of that box, I heard, through the thin glass of the cabin's front window, the distant crunch of a heavy truck on the logging road. Climbing the last grade to the cabin, Camille had arrived. I want to stop here for a moment, because I know what it is to watch something on a screen and feel your chest tighten. I know what it is to be 63 years old and to have lived through your own version of a sister at the door. If you are still with me, if any of this is reaching you tonight, I want you to take a breath, wherever you are. And I want you to know that what comes next is the part of the story where the woman you have been listening to finally, after 57 years, decides to stop being eaten alive. I closed the trap door. I pulled the rug back over the hearthstone. I stood up and brushed the dust off my grandmother's flannel shirt. I walked to the front window. The black F250 with Colorado plates was rolling up the last 100 feet of the road. Exactly the way Hollis had said it would, 14 days after the bank had flagged my address change. My grandfather had known. He had known 48 years ago that this exact moment would come. The truck stopped 20 feet from the porch. The driver's side door opened, and my sister Camille stepped out into the snow in a cream cashmere coat and pearl earrings, with her husband Brennan Brooks behind her in a black overcoat, and our cousin Roy Whitfield Jr. climbing out of the back seat in a hunting jacket and a forced smile. Camille had been the prettier sister our entire lives. She was 49 years old now. She had been a real estate attorney in Denver for 19 years. She made $400,000 a year. She drove a white Lexus SUV at home. She had borrowed her husband's truck for this trip, because, I would later realize, she had not wanted my neighbors in Hawthorne Bend to be able to identify her vehicle. She came up the porch steps with her arms already open. "Marin, sweetheart," she called out. Her voice was the sweet, warm voice she used in courtrooms. Thank God. Thank God. We have been worried sick. She tried to hug me. I stepped back. She did not let it show on her face that she had registered the step back. That was Camille. She let nothing show that she had not already decided to let show. Brennan stayed on the porch. Roy Jr. stayed at the truck. Camille stepped past me into the cabin uninvited. Her eyes moved across the room the way an appraiser's eyes move across an estate sale. The wall of photographs, the cast-iron stove, the pine table, the grandfather clock-shaped empty space on the floor where Whitman Tate's clock had stood 3 hours earlier. She turned to me. Her face had already rearranged itself into the second configuration she had practiced on the drive up. Sympathetic. Concerned. The face of a woman who had come a long way to deliver bad news kindly. "Marin," she said, "I am so glad you are safe. We have been trying to find you for weeks. Honey, I have to talk to you about the cabin. I know this is a hard time for you. I know you are in a vulnerable place. But this property is family property, and there are things in the estate that have not been settled, and I have already filed in Lincoln County to begin the partition process. I just need you to understand that this is not personal. This is what families have to do. Brennan pushed open the front door behind her without knocking. He had a leather portfolio under his arm. He set it on the dining table without asking. "We brought the paperwork," he said. "I did not invite them to sit down. I did not offer them coffee." I crossed to the dining table and opened the portfolio myself. Inside were court filings out of Lincoln County, dated 3 weeks earlier, demanding partition and sale of a property registered to one Silas Whitfield, deceased, whose estate had never been formally probated. And underneath the court filings, slightly out of place, was a thick, spiral-bound report on cream paper with a logo I did not recognize at the top. Granite Ridge Geological Survey, LLC. I lifted the cover. The first page was a topographical map of 42 acres along Spruce Creek, the same 42 acres that ran along the eastern edge of my grandfather's property. The second page was an executive summary. I read the first paragraph twice, then a third time. The 42 acres along Spruce Creek contained what the surveyors called historic placer claims with significant residual mineralization. In plain English, that creek had been a working gold and silver claim during the Montana mining boom of the 1870s. It had been abandoned in 1894. It had been re-registered under a corporate name in 1979 by a private party. The corporate name was Whitfield Holdings, LLC. The conservative valuation, given current commodity prices and modern extraction techniques, was somewhere between $14 and $22 million. I looked up. Camille was watching me with the patient, watchful expression of an attorney who had just played her best card, waiting to see whether the witness on the stand would crumble or fight. "I commissioned the survey 8 months ago," she said, quietly, "through a holding company. I have been the only person in the family who has ever bothered to find out what was actually here, Maren. And I am not going to let one sister who has not lifted a finger for this property in 30 years, sit on $20 million of family wealth that should belong to all of us. I am sorry. I love you, but I am going to fight you." I stood there at the dining table in my grandmother's flannel shirt, with my hand still resting on the cover of the Geological Survey. And I felt, for the first time in 2 years, something that was not exhaustion or grief or shame. I felt anger. Clean. Cold. Ancestral anger. The anger of every woman in my family for 4 generations who had given everything she had to people who had taken it as their birthright. "Camille," I said. My voice was very quiet. "I want you to drive back down that mountain. Right now. Today. And I want you to do it before I open the box my grandfather left for this exact moment." She laughed, a small, surprised laugh. "Maren, honey, I do not know what you think you have, but Brennan and I have been over the estate. There is no will. There is no trust. There is just an unprobated mess that the court is going to clean up. I am being kind by giving you the chance to settle this without litigation." I held her eyes. "There is a will," I said. "It was filed in Helena in 1991. The trust was funded in 1993. The cabin and the surrounding land and the mineral rights along Spruce Creek were all conveyed into the trust in October of 2009, 8 months before he died." I am the sole beneficiary. And there is one more document, Camille. There is one more document you do not want me to open. The smile slipped off her face by half a degree. Just half. But I had been studying my sister's face since 1976. Half a degree was a landslide. "What document?" she said. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the journal entry. I never wanted Marin to need it. I thought about my grandfather, in the last year of his life, sitting at a kitchen table in this cabin, deciding to keep a piece of evidence about his own granddaughter for 28 years, on the chance that one day his other granddaughter would need it to defend herself. "Drive back down the mountain, Camille," I said. "Tonight, before dark. Take Brennan. Take Roy. Withdraw the partition filing in Lincoln County by Friday, and we will never speak of this again. If you do not, I will open the document, and you will not survive it." She stood there in my grandfather's cabin in her cream cashmere coat, and for one long second her face was the face of a 6-year-old girl who had taken her cousin's dollhouse home in her suitcase. Then it closed. "You're bluffing," she said. "Try me," I said. She left within the hour. Brennan tried to argue. Roy Jr. stayed silent in the truck. Camille got back in the driver's seat without saying goodbye. I watched the F-250 disappear down the logging road through the trees. I watched it for a long time, even after it was gone. When I went back inside the cabin, Hollis Garrett was sitting at the dining table. He had come up onto the porch sometime during the conversation. I had not seen him do it. He looked at me with a small, careful smile. "Your grandfather told me you had a spine, Miss Whitfield. I'm starting to believe him." I opened the steel box that night. I waited until Marlene had gone home, until Hollis had retired to the small bedroom off the kitchen, until the cabin was quiet except for the soft, regular pop of pine knots in the stove. I lit a kerosene lamp. I knelt on the floor. I lifted the hearthstone. I lifted the lid of the box. There were 4 things inside. The first was a thick manila envelope of legal documents: deeds, trust paperwork, mineral rights claims for the 42 acres along Spruce Creek, registered in 1979 under Whitfield Holdings, LLC. A current statement from a small investment firm in Helena. The trust held over $1 million in cash. The mineral rights were appraised separately and conservatively at twice that, and there was a single typed sheet on the firm's letterhead listing 14 years of monthly royalty payments from a furniture patent my grandfather had licensed to a custom woodworking company in North Carolina in 2003. The royalties had been compounding in the trust for 14 years. They were now substantial. The second was a small velvet pouch. I opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was my grandmother Ingrid's wedding ring, the real one. The one I had grown up believing had been buried with her in 1995. It had been replaced in the casket, evidently, with a replica. The original had been waiting here, in this box, in this floor, for me, for 31 years. The third was a sealed letter, with my name on it, in my grandfather's handwriting. The fourth was a second sealed letter, this one in a heavier envelope, marked in his hand, to be opened only when Camille comes. I read mine first. "Marin, if you have gotten this far, you have already done the hardest part, which was surviving long enough to read this. I am proud of you. I was always proud of you, but I am proudest now. because I know what it cost. The money is yours. The land is yours. The cabin is yours. None of it is in your father's name, your uncle's name, your sister's name, or your son's name. Only yours. I built it that way on purpose. They cannot touch it. They cannot guilt it out of you. They cannot ask for just a little help until the well is dry. If they try, you tell them their grandfather said no on your behalf 40 years ago. But here is the harder part, kiddo. Money will not fix what is broken in you. You know that. You have watched it not fix people your whole life. What this is a door. You decide what you walk through toward. And one more thing. Call your son. He has been waiting longer than you think. Silas. I held the letter against my chest. I bowed my head. And I cried. I opened the second envelope a long while later. Inside were photocopies of 3 documents. The first was a notarized affidavit from a woman named Helene Birchwood Whitfield, my grandmother on my mother's side, dated October of 1998. The second was a copy of a signature page from a real estate transfer in suburban Denver, dated August of that same year, in which our mother had purportedly signed over a small rental property to her younger daughter Camille for the consideration of $1. The third was a forensic handwriting analysis, commissioned by my grandfather Silas through a private investigator in 1999, concluding that the signature on the transfer document was, in the analyst's professional opinion, not consistent with the known signature exemplars of the named transferor. In other words, the signature was a forgery. Our mother had been in a memory care facility at the time. She had died 11 months later. The rental property had passed quietly into Camille's name and had been sold for $240,000 in 2003. My grandfather had known. My grandfather had known for 28 years. He had paid an investigator out of his own pocket. He had filed the report away. He had never used it. He had kept it, on the chance that one day his granddaughter Maren would need it to defend herself from her own sister. I did not use it either, not the way Camille had assumed I would. I drove down to Helena 3 days later. I sat across from a 79-year-old attorney named Alden Bramwell, who had been my grandfather's friend for 53 years and had drafted the original trust in 1991. Alden read the documents in silence. He took off his reading glasses. He looked at me over them with eyes the color of river stone. "Maren," he said, "the trust your grandfather built cannot be broken. Your sister's filing in Lincoln County will be dismissed within 45 days. You do not need this affidavit to protect the cabin." "I know," I said. "Then what do you want me to do with it?" I told him. He wrote a very short letter on his firm's letterhead. He mailed it to my sister Camille that afternoon. The letter did not threaten. It did not accuse. It simply informed her, in 3 measured paragraphs, that certain documents from 1998 had come into the possession of the firm of Bramwell and Associates, and that Bramwell and Associates would be retaining those documents in our files indefinitely, and that any future legal action against the Whitfield Trust or against Maren Whitfield personally would prompt the immediate transmission of those documents to the appropriate authorities. Camille withdrew the partition filing 8 days later. She wrote me a single email 2 weeks after that. "Maren, I always thought he loved you more than me. Now I know why. I did not write back. I have not spoken to my sister since. I want to tell you something. I want to tell you that it felt good, that I felt powerful, that I felt vindicated. But the truth is, I sat in my truck in the parking lot of Alden Bramwell's office that afternoon, after we mailed the letter, and I cried for an hour, not for me, for the 6-year-old girl who had taken her cousin's dollhouse home in her suitcase and grown up into a woman who could not stop, for my mother, in her memory care facility, who had not been able to defend herself, for my grandfather, who had carried that secret for 28 years rather than blow up his own family. There is no version of justice in this world that is not also, somewhere underneath, a kind of grief. I called my son Lyndon on the last Sunday, in June. I had thought about it every day for 2.5 months, and I had not been able to do it once. Every time I picked up the phone, I rehearsed the wrong sentence, or imagined the wrong silence on the other end, or felt the old shame rise in my throat like a hand closing. So I waited. I let the cabin do its work on me. I split firewood until my shoulders were strong again. I learned to feed the chickens Hollis kept in a coop behind the cabin. I learned to candle eggs. I learned to bake bread in the cast-iron stove. I walked the property with Hollis and Marlene. I learned where the property lines ran, where the creek bent, where the old gold claim sat under 50 feet of granite and pine. I let my hair go gray without dyeing it. I slept 8 hours a night for the first time in a decade. I read my grandfather's journal until I could hear his voice in the silences between the entries. And then, on a Sunday afternoon in late June, sitting on the front porch with a glass of iced tea and my phone on my lap, I called my son. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Mom?" he said. "Hi." There was a long pause. I could hear traffic in the background, the hum of a city. I could hear him breathing. "Where are you?" he asked. His voice was careful. "I tried your apartment. The number is disconnected. I tried your old work email. It bounced. I called Verna Cole from your old office. She said you just disappeared. Nobody knew anything. I didn't know." He stopped. I heard him swallow. "I didn't know if you were okay." I closed my eyes. "I'm okay, Lyndon. I'm at Grandpa Silas's cabin in Montana, the hunting cabin. Do you remember it?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I remember it," he said. "There was a wall of carved owls. I was little. You were holding me. I remember Grandma Ingrid's quilts on the bed. I thought I dreamed it. You didn't dream it, honey. You were 2. We were here for 9 days. You made me promise I would bring you back when you were older. I never did." I drew a slow breath. "I'm sorry, honey. I'm sorry for a lot of things. I'm sorry I missed your wedding from a hospice room. I'm sorry I missed your 30th birthday. I'm sorry I let myself disappear into Grandpa Donovan's last years until I disappeared from you, too. I do not expect you to forgive any of it. I just need to say it out loud, because I do not want to die without having said it." I heard him exhale. It was the kind of exhale I used to hear when he was a small boy and had finally stopped fighting sleep. "Mom," he said, "can I come see you?" I put a hand over my mouth. "Yes," I said. "Please." He came the following weekend. He flew into Missoula. He rented a car. He drove the 4 hours into the Cabinets. And he pulled up to the cabin in the long blue evening of a Friday in early July. He stepped out of the car taller than I remembered, broader through the shoulders, the beginning of gray in his beard. He looked, in that first instant, exactly like my father. And then, in the second instant, exactly like my grandfather. And then, finally, exactly like himself. My son. My boy. The only person in the world I had made. He hugged me on the porch for a long time. Neither of us spoke. We did not need to. He told me, that first night, sitting at the dining table with 2 cups of coffee between us, that he had flown to Portland twice in the last 14 months, that he had stood outside my apartment building both times, that he had not been able to make himself walk in. He told me that after the second time, he had hired a private investigator to find me, and the investigator had tracked me as far as a truck stop in Missoula and lost me in the storm. He told me his wife, Maya, was 5 months pregnant. He told me they had been arguing about names. Maya wanted to name the baby, if it was a girl, after me. Lyndon had been afraid I would never meet her. He had been afraid the name would become a wound instead of a gift. I cried at the dining table. He cried at the dining table. Hollis Garrett, who had been sitting in the rocking chair by the stove pretending to read a feed catalog the entire time, stood up quietly, put on his coat, and walked outside without a word, leaving a son and his mother alone in a cabin in the mountains for the first time in 14 years. Lyndon stayed for 9 days. Exactly 9 days. The same 9 days I had spent at this cabin with him as a baby in 1996. I did not point this out to him, but I suspected, watching him scrape his boots on the iron scraper my grandfather had hammered into the porch in 1962, on his last morning, that he had counted them, too. He and Hollis built a swing for the baby on the 7th day. They hung it from the limb of the big ponderosa pine at the edge of the meadow. Marlene taught me how to make huckleberry pie. We took a photograph of all 4 of us on the porch the morning Lyndon left. I framed it that night. I hung it on the wall. I want you to take a moment with me before I tell you the last part. If you have stayed with me this long, if any piece of this story has reached the place inside you where your own losses live, I want you to know that I see you. I want you to know that I am 60 years old now in this telling, looking back at 57. And I can promise you, sister to sister, across whatever distance there is between us, that the doors we think have closed forever are sometimes only waiting for us to learn the right knock. If you have someone you have not called in a long time, someone you have been afraid to call, I want you to write their name in the comments tonight. Just the name. You do not have to call them. Just write the name. Sometimes that is how the door begins to open. From your side first. By the end of that first summer, I had quietly done 3 things. The first was hire Alden Bramwell to put the cabin and the surrounding 60 acres in a new trust, under my own name, and Lyndon's name, and eventually my granddaughter's name, with provisions that no other relative could ever attach a claim to it. My grandfather had built the wall. I was reinforcing it. The second was reach out to Marlene and offer her a small monthly stipend from the trust, as a long overdue thank you for 14 years of silent watchfulness. Hollis tried to refuse. Marlene did not. She used the first 3 months of payments to repaint her late mother's house in Hawthorne Bend. The third was the thing that would matter most. I founded the Hearth Project in late September of 2026. It was small at first. Just me. A 1-page website I built myself on a borrowed laptop. And a 1-page mission statement. The Hearth Project was for women over 50 who had been laid off, divorced, widowed, or worn down by years of caretaking. It paid emergency rent. It funded retraining. It connected women to lawyers, to therapists, and to each other. Every woman who applied received a handwritten letter from me. Every letter ended the same way. You are not finished. You are between things. There is a door you have not walked through yet. Walk through it. The first phone call I made was to Verna Cole. I pulled out the small folded square of paper that had been sitting in the pocket of my navy blazer for almost a year. Her phone number. I'm still here. V. She was 60 years old, recently widowed, spending her mornings drinking coffee alone in her condo in West Lynn. I asked her if she would be the executive director. She said yes, within 30 seconds. She moved to Hawthorne Bend in October. I called Odessa Halloran at the Maple Leaf Diner in Missoula. She had told me, that first morning, that her husband Wendell had died in 2018. She had not told me that he had been, for 33 years, a furniture craftsman trained by my grandfather. She had not told me that the diner she ran was the diner she had inherited from her own mother, and that she had been thinking about selling it for 5 years because she had no children to leave it to. I asked her if she would be the regional coordinator for the Hearth Project across western Montana. She said yes the same afternoon. She did not sell the diner. She turned the back room into our western Montana intake office. By the end of the second year, the Hearth Project had helped 147 women. By the end of the fifth, it had helped over 1,000. Lyndon's daughter was born in November. They named her Iris Marin Whitfield Marsh. Lyndon sent me a photograph the morning she came home from the hospital. She was wrapped in a pale yellow blanket. She had a full head of dark hair. She had her great-great-grandfather's eyes. I drove down to Austin for Christmas. I stayed for 2 weeks. I held her every day. I told her, in whispers, the names of every Whitfield woman who had come before her, all the way back to her great-great-great-grandmother Astrid, who had crossed the Atlantic from Norway in 1898 and homesteaded outside Glasgow, Montana, with 2 daughters and a husband who died of pneumonia within the first winter. The summer Iris turned 4, in the 3rd year of the Hearth Project. Lyndon and Maya brought her to the cabin for the first time. They drove up from Austin in a rented SUV. They pulled up to the cabin in the long blue evening of a Friday in July. Iris jumped out of the car in cowgirl boots and a dress with strawberries on it. She ran past me on the porch. She stopped at the iron boot scraper my grandfather had hammered into the planks in 1962. She had never been told what it was. She scraped her boots on it twice. Hard. The way Lyndon had done at her age. The way I had done at her age. The way my father had done at her age. Then she came up the steps. She put her small hand into mine. She looked up at me. "Grandma, where is the wall of pictures?" Daddy told me about the wall. I took her inside. I lifted her up so she could see. She pointed at the photograph of me at 9, in my grandfather's flannel jacket, missing 2 front teeth. "Grandma," she said, "that's me." I almost dropped her. I did not. I held on. I held on. "That's me, baby," I said, "when I was 9, before you were born." She looked at it for a long time. Then she patted the wall with her small open hand. We looked the same. I took a photograph of her that evening. On the porch, in her great-great-grandfather's flannel jacket. The same flannel jacket. missing 2 front teeth, laughing at something off camera. I hung it on the wall the next morning, beside the photograph of me at 9. The 2 photographs are 48 years and 6 generations apart, but you cannot tell them apart unless you look very closely. Hollis Garrett is 75 now. He still comes by every Sunday for coffee. Marlene is 72. She is teaching me to quilt. The grandfather clock my grandfather built for Calvin Tate runs every day in the bedroom of an 18-year-old boy in Denver named Calvin Tate III. He sends me a card every Christmas. My sister Camille is still in Denver. She remarried in 2027. I send her a card every December. She has never written back. I have made my peace with that. Some doors do not open from the other side. That is not your fault, and it is not your job to keep knocking. I am 60 years old as I tell you this story. I live year-round in my grandfather's cabin in the Cabinet Mountains of Montana. I split my own firewood. I bake my own bread. I run a foundation that has helped, as of last month, 1,462 women find the door they were too tired to see. I am not finished. I am between things. Some doors, when you walk through them, stay open behind you. Some doors are meant to. My grandfather knew. He had always known. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it has touched your heart tonight, I would be deeply grateful if you subscribe to this channel. I tell stories about hope, about second chances, about finding home in unexpected places. And the only thing that keeps these stories coming is you, sitting wherever you are sitting tonight, deciding to stay. I want to ask you one last question before we say goodnight. Have you ever found family in a place you never expected? Maybe a neighbor who became closer than blood. Maybe a stranger at a counter who saw you on your worst day. Maybe a grandmother whose love reached you long after she was gone. Tell me their name in the comments. Tell me one sentence about them. I read every single one. And remember, sister, it is never too late to walk through a door someone has been holding open for you. Drive safe. I will see you tomorrow.